In May 1428, a 16-year-old peasant girl, dressed in a rough red homespun skirt, stood inside the fortress of Vaucouleurs, speaking to the local governor, Robert de Baudricourt. She was telling him some astonishing things. She claimed that her lord had sent her with a message for the Dauphin of France, that he would be granted divine aid in his war against the English. The girl clarified that her mission was not on behalf of the state, but rather for her lord, who wanted the crown placed upon the Dauphin's head, and she would lead the ceremony of coronation. The governor asked, "Who is your lord?" She replied, "The King of Heaven." This was beyond Baudricourt's comprehension. The girl had come with her uncle, and the governor ordered her uncle to take her back home to her father, or else he would hand her over to his soldiers. The governor assumed she would not return, but he was wrong.
8 months later, she came back. This time, she had left her home for good, which was 12 miles away.
For the past 5 years, she had been hearing the voices of angels. They told her that God had chosen her for an extraordinary mission. At that time, France was in a pitiful state. She was to take up arms, lift the Siege of Orléans, which had not yet begun, and lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. At first she had been terrified and argued with the voices. But then, Saint Michael appeared before her, urging her to believe and follow the divine instructions.
So in her village of Domremy, on the eastern plains, she continued working on the farm, helping her mother with chores, while keeping the secret of the voices hidden in her heart. Her parents were simple folk, and naturally hoped she would marry a local peasant. But only she knew that this was not her destiny. Later, when asked if she considered it a sin to leave her parents behind, she replied, "Since God commanded me, I had to obey. Even if I had 100 fathers and 100 mothers, even if I had been a king's daughter, I would have still left them behind. I had to surrender everything."
So in January 1429, Joan of Arc returned to Baudricourt once again. In a nearby village outside the fortress, 2 officers were convinced by her words. One of them even held her hand and swore
that God was with them, and that he would indeed take her to the Dauphin. He asked her, "When do you want to leave?" She replied, "Rather today than tomorrow, and tomorrow rather than the day after." They dressed her in a soldier's uniform, freeing her forever from her red peasant skirt.
Baudricourt still harbored doubts, unsure whether she was truly receiving divine messages from God, or perhaps being deceived by the devil.
So he summoned a priest to question her. After the priest assured him that her words were sincere and faithful, Baudricourt finally agreed to send her to the Dauphin of France. Joan departed with 2 companions on the afternoon of Wednesday, February 23rd. Some townspeople even gifted her a horse, and as they watched her ride off, they had no idea that even the horse would become part of history.
Although Joan's words shone with confidence and conviction, these men were willing to help not just because of her faith, but because the military situation was utterly hopeless.
The English were at war with the French, and the French themselves were divided and fighting each other.
The English kings had already established control over large parts of France, and ever since Edward III's claim to the French throne in 1377, the English had expanded their territory further. The campaigns of Henry V, who invaded France in 1415, led to a treaty proclaiming him as regent and heir to the French crown. He even married Catherine, daughter of King Charles VI. That same treaty declared the Dauphin, Charles VII, illegitimate, a fool with no place in France's political future. Whether or not the Dauphin was truly Charles's son was still in serious doubt. This cloud of uncertainty hung over France even after the deaths of both Charles VI and Henry V in 1422. The kingdom remained divided. Some supported the Dauphin, while others backed the young son of Henry and Catherine.
Meanwhile, two factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, Orleanists, had already been fighting over the French throne. Since 1422, the Orleanists supported the Dauphin, who had become the symbol of a nationalist France,
while the English, backed by the Duke of Burgundy, sought to impose their own king. There were no signs of this struggle ending. While the English, backed by the Duke of Burgundy, sought to impose their own king. There were no signs of this struggle ending. But the journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin was staying, was 350 miles long and passed through enemy-controlled territory.
Joan's two companions had now become true believers in her divine mission. They were deeply moved by her spiritual strength, and even more by the fact that she showed no fear whatsoever.
Whenever her companions began to lose courage or feel uncertain, Joan would uplift their spirits and restore their confidence. On Sunday, March 6th, the group finally reached Chinon. The city's majestic fortress stood tall and proud. They were granted access to the grand hall of the castle, where 50 torches were lit and around 300 courtiers had gathered. Joan walked straight toward the Dauphin, who was surrounded by the crowd, and said, "My name is Joan the Maiden. The King of Heaven has sent me to you with this message. You will be crowned in the city of Reims, and you are the helper of the heavenly King, who is also the true King of France." The Dauphin was not convinced, and so he handed her over to professors and religious authorities to question her. After answering their inquiries, Joan had them write a letter addressed to the English, which said, "King of England, and you, Duke of Bedford, go back to your country in God's name. If you do not, you will suffer a great defeat." The scholars and clergy presented a favorable report on Joan. They stated, "The Dauphin can make use of this girl without risk of harm." Charles and his council agreed, and Joan was entrusted with military responsibilities. She was granted equal status with the commanders, though not placed above them. 4 weeks later, she was marching toward Orléans, accompanied by an army of 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers. Although she didn't hold a supreme command, Joan created a spiritual atmosphere among the troops, one reminiscent of the fervor of the Crusades. She urged the men to frequently confess their sins and keep their hearts pure. News of Joan's arrival reached Orléans even before she did, and the people were filled with hope. The city had been under siege for nearly 6 months. Both sides had their honor and pride at stake. The River Loire protected the city from the south. To the west and north, 5 English-held fortresses blocked access. But in the east, only 2 English forts stood, with 3 miles between them, a vulnerable space through which occasional supplies and troops could still reach the city. The English besieging forces were limited in number. Though the townspeople could still receive some supplies, they were far from sufficient. This was the situation when Joan arrived. On April 28th, the army from Blois camped 1 mile east of Orléans. However, the River Loire still lay between them and the city. Joan was unaware of this plan, or perhaps deliberately kept uninformed. When she found out, she was furious. Her plan had been to launch a sudden attack on the English, not to wait. The reason given for the delay was that livestock needed to be brought into the city, and they had to be ferried across the River Loire first. They planned to cross the river with the livestock and later enter from the northern side, approaching Orléans from the west, the safest route. But Joan had no interest in the livestock. When Dunois of Orléans, the illegitimate brother of the Duke and a military commander, crossed the river to welcome her. Joan confronted him. "Was it you who advised them to bring me to this side of the river instead of sending me directly to Talbot?" "Yes," he replied, "because it was the wisest and most sensible course of action."
Joan responded firmly. Then a miracle happened. "The advice of our Lord is better and wiser than yours."
The boats loaded with livestock were struggling to sail upstream against the river current. Since the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, they were unable to move forward.
Joan told Dunois to wait and assured him that everything would soon be fine. And then, suddenly, the wind changed direction. Dunois later said, "At that moment, I became more hopeful than I had ever been before. I attached so much hope to her, more than I had ever attached before. And that's when I advised her to cross the river and enter the town of Orléans, because she deeply wished to enter the city." But Joan objected to that plan. The army was too small to break the siege, and it was being sent back to Blois. For some reason, Joan insisted on going with them, and Dunois was unable to stop her. Eventually, Dunois crossed the river, and they entered Orléans through the eastern gate. Their arrival was nothing short of a victorious triumph.
As night fell, the citizens and soldiers surrounded Joan, holding torches, while she rode through the streets on a white horse.
It appeared as though God Himself had descended among them. People rushed to touch her, overcome with awe.
That night, after dinner, Joan stayed at the house of Gilles de Beauchamp, the treasurer of the Duke of Orléans.
The next day, Joan got into a heated argument with the Duke. She wanted to launch an immediate assault on the English, but the Duke disagreed.
Joan warned him that he should leave the city in the name of God, otherwise she would drive him out herself. They angrily shouted at her,
"You damned Armagnac cow! If we ever catch you, we'll burn you alive!"
The following morning, the Orléans generals left the city to bring more troops from Blois. For the next 3 days, Joan roamed the streets, waiting for action. She continued to take part in the public processions. Then, on May 4th, she went to meet fresh troops who had just arrived. They advanced toward Orléans, and the English made no move to respond. Could this have been further proof that divine assistance was on her side? The people of Orléans must certainly have believed so by that evening. Later that afternoon, the French army launched an assault, and for the first time since the siege began, they achieved a clear victory. They captured an English fort known as Fort St. Loup, located 2 miles from the city. At the time, Joan was at home, asleep and unaware of the attack. But then, as she later described, her heavenly voices awoke her and warned her that French blood was being spilled. She immediately rushed toward the eastern gate.
As soon as the French troops saw Joan arriving, they cheered and clapped, and with renewed spirit, they captured the fort and its towers.
3 days later, this victory was repeated.
For 6 months, the French had made no significant progress. But now, inspired by Joan, they crossed to the southern bank of the river and launched an assault on another English stronghold, Fort Saint-Jean-le-Blanc.
The English soldiers stationed there fled, seeking refuge in a nearby fort, located half a mile to the west from where they kept watch over the main bridge route into the city.
English reinforcements emerged from Fort Boulevard d'Auxerre and, together with the soldiers from the nearby fort, counterattacked the French, forcing them to retreat toward their boats. But at that critical moment, Joan arrived on the southern bank. She rallied the troops and pushed the English back to their defensive positions. After intense fighting, the French emerged victorious. That night, Joan camped alongside the men. The people of Orléans understood the significance of this victory. They brought bread and wine for the soldiers in celebration. But the senior commanders remained hesitant and fearful. As Joan was eating, one of the officers came to inform her of the decision made for the next day. There would be no new attack. No offensive action would be taken as the army was too small and needed reinforcements. Joan replied firmly,
You make your decisions, and I will act according to my Lord's decision. And I know his decision is always the better one. On Saturday, May 7th, at 7 a.m., a massive attack was launched. The target was the southern end of the main bridge. There were many obstacles. First, a deep moat, followed by a mound of earth acting as a second barrier.
The fighting lasted all day. Joan crossed the moat successfully. Around midday, she was struck in the chest, just above her left breast, by an arrow that penetrated 6 inches deep. She pulled the arrow out herself. She pulled the arrow out of her body herself. Her wound was treated and bandaged, and after resting briefly, she returned to the battlefield.
Crossing the remaining obstacles seemed extremely difficult. By 8 p.m., after 13 hours of intense fighting, the troops were exhausted, and the generals issued orders to retreat.
This attack proved successful, and the English forces fell into chaos. Some of them fled toward the bridge. The French targeted the bridge, and it was destroyed, causing many English soldiers to drown in the river. Joan then called out to the English commander, "Lay down your weapons!"
And shortly after, every English soldier on the bridge was either killed or captured. That night, the bells of Orleans rang in celebration. Joan had her wound rebandaged and calmly enjoyed a dinner of bread and wine.
By now, people on both sides believed Joan possessed supernatural powers. The difference was only in interpretation. The English called her a witch and sorceress, while the French hailed her as a saint or mystic. Victory now seemed far out of reach for the English, while the French were fighting with renewed hope and spirit. At last, France was on its path to liberation from the invaders. Joan's fame spread far and wide, and even Charles VII was now full of hope. Joan had promised to crown him king, and soon she would fulfill that promise at the city of Rheims.